Welcome! It's Ashley from Demystifying Your Health. Thank you for joining me today. In this episode, we're going to be talking about autism. The increase in diagnosis of autism has been on the rise for the past several years. So this means more and more people are interacting with individuals who have autism. So how do you know if someone has autism? What can you do to help support them? And is it preventable? Let's find out. Autism is a condition that affects brain development. People who have it find it challenging to comprehend information and socialize with others. Also, they often have repetitive behavior patterns. So this means they're going to do a task again and again and again. For instance, they might ask the same question repeatedly, even though they know the answer to the question. There's no specific cause. It's thought to be a combination of genetic factors and environmental triggers. It's important to note there was a study done back in the 1990s indicating a link between childhood vaccinations and the development of autism. Examination of the findings of the study showed that there wasn't enough data in the study to prove what they reported. Also, subsequent studies have disproven that theory too. So despite there being pervasive information out there saying that autism is linked to childhood vaccinations, this simply isn't true. There are different levels of severity, mild, moderate to severe. This is why it's called autism spectrum disorder, because people fall somewhere in that wide range. You have autism, you have Asperger's syndrome, you have childhood integrative syndrome, and those are just a few of the examples of individuals within the group. Boys are 4 times more likely to be affected than girls. And symptoms usually appear with either in the first year of the child's life, or the child develops normally until they have a period of regression, somewhere around 18 to 24 months, and that's when symptoms start appearing. Let's take a closer look at what some possible symptoms are. When it comes to autism symptoms, they are varied as well, and it can include things like lack of response to their name, reduced eye contact, indifference to caregivers, meaning that it seems like it doesn't matter who takes care of them, they will interact with whomever's there. There's no preference. They often appear withdrawn. Sometimes they can be aggressive. They can lose language skills they've already acquired, or they don't speak at all, or they have a hard time learning language. They don't like being touched and can be sensitive to things such as light, sound, and texture, but often aren't sensitive to things like pain or temperature. So they might not be able to tell you if they're too hot or too cold, or if they're injured, sometimes the reaction is not appropriate to the level of the injury. Sometimes it's an overreaction, other times there's no reaction. So this can make it hard to judge exactly if they're injured or not. They prefer playing alone, but don't engage in make-believe play. So they might like to play with certain objects and don't want to interact with others, but they're not going to do imaginative play. So they won't have like a make-believe friend. They're not going to be doing anything along that line. They often lack facial expressions, meaning they are not able to express how they're feeling on their face. It's usually very flat. They aren't good at conversation, meaning they aren't good at starting conversation, they aren't good at maintaining conversation. Often if they are able to speak and are able to engage, the center of what they're talking about has 1 or 2 very narrow topics. They're unable to engage on multiple things, and they don't understand the natural flow of conversation. They don't understand simple questions or directions. So if you give them directions, it has to be very basic, and sometimes even that is, depending on the individual, they don't understand that as well. They can repeat words and phrases verbatim. So when you give them a phrase, they'll repeat it back to you, but they won't understand the meaning of that phrase or the word. They are unaware of others' feelings. Obviously, for them, they're often not in tune with their own feelings, so for them to be aware of others is something that is above their capabilities usually. They can't read nonverbal body cues. So if someone is talking and they have a smile on their face but their arms are crossed, maybe the person's angry, maybe the person's happy, but the individual with autism or somewhere on the autism spectrum is unable to determine that. They do repetitive motions, which is where they have like a rocking back and forth. They do hand flapping and other things that they just have to do because it's part of their developmental process. Other times they get fixated on an object and to the point of exclusivity, meaning they will lose interest in everything else and they're only focused on that one object. And sometimes it can be a specific item, other times it can be a specific question if they're able to speak. And they get fixated on one thing, like an upcoming event or something that they'd like to go do. And then they like routines and become stressed out at the slightest changes to their routines. So this is why, in some ways, when you have someone on the autism spectrum, depending on their own, where they fall in that, they can either, if you we've helped them plan accordingly by saying this is what we're going to do here this day, this is what we're going to do this day. Other individuals, that's even too uncomfortable, and they just have to have their routine every single day, regardless of the day of year, regardless of what else is going on. So this is where, as you can see, there's a wide variety of things that can be an autism spectrum symptom. Every individual is different. Every individual, as far as which one of these are more prevalent versus not, is significantly different. So that's why it's very hard to know sometimes how to interact with individuals on the spectrum, because obviously you don't know where they are unless you know them well enough to know how they respond to some of these things. So that's why it's important when you're first interacting with someone, just take your time, get to know the person, and then that way you're able to judge, based off of what you're able to see, the best ways to interact and communicate with them. When it comes to treating autism, it's important to realize that it's going to be different for each person. Obviously, as I mentioned before, it's a spectrum. So everybody's symptoms and how severe their condition is going to dictate what type of treatment that they need. The goal is to maximize their ability to function by reducing symptoms and supporting development and learning. So the main way to do this is various types of therapy, and there are plenty. There's behavioral, communication, speech, physical, educational, occupational, and family. So all of these are going to be needed in some form or another for most people on the autism spectrum. And in addition, there will be medications. And once again, there are so many different options depending on the person's symptoms and if they have any other underlying physical conditions, any other underlying mental health conditions. Often people who are on the spectrum have something of those as well. So this is why it's so important to make sure that you have a care team that you trust, because you need to be able to have all these different personnel interacting, coordinating to get the best care possible for the individual. And it's important to note, as the child ages and gets older, they're going to become more engaged and usually have fewer behavioral disturbances. So obviously some points during the teenage years, due to fluctuations in hormones, sometimes those get a little out of balance and you might see either aggressive behavior, sometimes a child who was calm and quiet when they were younger now suddenly become loud and have outbursts. It really just depends, but usually by the time the individual gets to adulthood, that has a tendency to subside. Obviously with the proper interventions as well, that helps. And you must plan for the future, because often these individuals will require some level of care throughout their lives. And this doesn't mean you're going to need all of these for the extent of the person's life, but they often can't live on their own. There's such things as group homes where they can live with other individuals who are highly functioning, and they can go out and work under supervision, and then they come home and they've got someone there who supervises several of these adults together. Otherwise, if they're unable to do that, they might be at home with a caregiver or a parent being a caregiver. So it's really important to make sure you're planning ahead to know for this individual they're going to get the care that they need for their entire life. So let's take a closer look at if it's possible to prevent autism. When it comes to preventing autism, unfortunately, there's no way to prevent the condition currently. A ton of research is being done to obviously figure out what the cause is, so hopefully we can figure out a way to prevent it in the future. So the big thing here, though, is you want to prevent long-term impacts on the person by getting an early diagnosis and intervention in place. So you want to seek treatment if the child doesn't respond to you smiling or making happy expressions by 6 months of age, if they don't mimic sounds or facial expressions by 9 months of age, if they don't babble or coo by 12 months, if they don't gesture, point, or wave by 14 months, if they don't say a single word by the 16 months, if they don't play pretend by 18 months, or if they don't say two-word phrases by 24 months. Also, if they suddenly lose any language skills that they already had, that would be an indication you want to get them evaluated. So as you can see, there are certain progress points that children normally make that if your child misses them, obviously you shouldn't panic, but you should have them evaluated. Some children are just late bloomers and they take a little bit longer to develop. Others, it can be an indication that they are on the autism spectrum disorder. And I know it can be very concerning for parents when they first get that diagnosis, but with early intervention, it can make a world of difference as far as how your child responds and the type of life they can have. So the key is recognizing where they should be, and then if they aren't, getting that early help as soon as possible. Finding out your child has autism can be overwhelming, disheartening, you name it. It's just an emotion you can't describe. Obviously, it's going to be life-changing, not only for you, for them, and for everyone else involved in their life. So the key thing is focusing on the triumphs that come from overcoming those challenges. And remember, each person on the autism spectrum is unique, and they just have a different way of expressing themselves. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you found the information to be valuable and helpful. If you had any questions or comments, put them below. Send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. Like, share, subscribe, tell your friends about us. And until next time, stay healthy.